basically using ecosystem shifts in terms of what we understand and of ecosystem processes, right? Nutrient cycles, fire perturbation regimes, land use cover changes, all those things that can be integrated into basically what we would expect to see changes in a watershed. So to establish magnitude of anthropogenic impacts from lake sediment records. And this is obviously a work in progress. And so what I'll show you today is basically some of the results that we've been getting that I think are very, very relevant to the People 3K group. All right, so basically, we know that lake sediments basically make up the brunt of what we know about climate change during the Holocene at centennial and multi-decadal timescales. Of course, there are a number of other markers that we use to establish paleoclimate, including speleothems, backrat mittens, and other records. But I would say that lake sediments by far, right, are probably some of the most important records in terms of continuous sedimentation records that we have. So they would make ideal records to compare, right, to show the impact of human activities, not only on regional scales, right, which is what People 3K is interested in, but also on local scales, right, at the watershed scale. So usually you can basically, the idea is that any impacts that you can see at a watershed scale could also be, in terms of, could also be extrapolated to what you're seeing at the regional scale if you can get several lake records from several different basins to compare. So the questions that we have here are basically, is how sensitive are lake sedimentary records to human activities in the watershed? What proxies are best in terms of, how can we tease apart these signals of human activities versus other signals that would be more natural, like, for example, orbitally driven climate change or the other climate, other events that are associated with climate change. Can we then, use any proxies from the lake sediments themselves to reconstruct local past population sizes? And these are basically the questions that we have that are linked, to try and compare these with regional SPDs that we have, right? So we can compare the regional SPDs with the local population reconstruction and see how much they match or mismatch. And then the idea is that, can we control for these multiple variables, right? So we have climate, vegetation, land use cover changes, fire impacts, et cetera. So is there any way to tease apart all these different variables that we can see that are integrated in a lake sedimentary record? So with that in mind, we started many years back. We started with a different objective, actually, is to basically understand climate change in Chile. Is that we started this big project with the Spanish Sea Council. So basically, these are to look at different lake records from northern and central Chile. So all the stars here are lake records that we've been looking at, and it's basically an ongoing effort between our lab at Católica, the Institute of Pyrenean Ecology in Zaragoza in Spain, and which is now part of the defunct Link Global, which is now no longer active. So basically, this is work in progress by one of my grad students. This is Carolina, who most of you met at the San Rafael meeting. And so Carolina has been working on her thesis to try and understand the impact of the transition, right, from this period of hunter-gatherers that we have here in central Chile, which lasted until about 2,000 years ago, and then transitioned into these first agricultural groups, the Baton Yoyo groups, right? So that occurred right in that period. And what we were interested in understanding with Carolina is, what did that period do in terms of population size in the region of central Chile? What did it do also in terms of the impacts of these increased populations on the local ecosystems? So could we tease out those signals? And so we actually backpedaled here, and we started looking with another grad student of mine, Magdalena, to see, what really is the magnitude of human impact on lakes, especially, what if we looked at the very, very recent record and see what were the impacts that people were having in terms of, really serious, demographic growth. So we started looking at these lake records. So here's Magdalena right there in the picture, standing next to what is now a dry Laguna Matanzas. That was actually a lake until 2016, basically. And then it's been dried out for the last couple of years due to the mega drought that we've been having. And then we looked at Lago Bichuquén, right? So these are two lakes located in central Chile where we've been looking at to understand sort of the very recent history of human impacts in these areas. So basically, it's more of an Anthropocene-oriented study, right? But the reasoning is the same. What are the magnitude of human impacts on lake records, and how can we tease these signals apart? So basically, this is an HDEV model of Laguna Matanzas. Basically, I won't get into too much detail, but it has really, really good chronology in the upper part of the core. And so these are the last basically 200 years in Laguna Matanzas, and you can see all the different variables that we're looking at from the biogeochemical point of view, and also from a stable isotope point of view. And what you can see here is that basically, despite the fact that land use changes have been going on in Laguna Matanzas since the Spanish colonial epoch, there really isn't very much in terms of what's going on in terms of all these different, geochemical, biogeochemical indicators. So for example, this is a record of precipitation from tree rings, and this is a lake record temperature from Aguileo Lake in central Chile. And you can see that a lot of these changes that are driving nitrogen 15 changes and changes in the carbon cycle through delta C13, and for example, redox conditions in the lake are for the most part tracking climate change, so they're tracking precipitation until the very end, right? So you get up into the 1950s, and then you see this big deviation going on here, and it's actually these large alterations that you're seeing in the nitrogen cycle, which are reflected in the nitrogen isotopes and in the total nitrogen that is available from the sediments, as well as this negative excursion in terms of the del C13, are really impacts of basically forest plantations, what we think are forest plantations that are going on in these watersheds, and Magdalena was able to calibrate for that using Landsat, satellite imagery. So actually, you can read about all this. This just came out, I think, 2 weeks ago. So there's the link there, so you can actually, she basically just published this record in Scientific Reports. And so this is the other record that I was going to talk about. This is Vichuquen. And so Vichuquen has already been, there's part of the record we already published. You can see that citation down there. And this record actually spans about 8,000 years. And it's basically a really nice high resolution record that we've been looking at from central Chile. And to understand sort of what human impacts are on the watershed as well, especially in the late Holocene. And one of the things that Magdalena looked at also is looking at the last several hundred years in Vichuquen, and this is basically the last 700 years on the Vichuquen record. And you can see also that for the most part, natural climate variability is driving a lot of the nutrient state changes that you're seeing in the record during, associated with, in this case, the severity drought index and temperature, driving basically what you're seeing in terms of the total nitrogen, carbon 13, and the redox changes in the lake. But as you get into the into the 20th century, basically the start of the Anthropocene in central Chile, you're starting to see these large negative excursions, right, in the nitrogen 15, increases in total nitrogen that are far beyond the natural range of the record in the past. So basically what we're thinking is that in terms of land use cover changes, it really is the major driver that what we're seeing these watersheds that are driving all these lake records into basically unknown territory, right, compared to the late Holocene. So, this is I'm already past time. Sorry, Eric. But basically, this is a really cool diagram that Magdalena did to understand basically the impacts on the nitrogen cycle that all these different processes have in terms of the nitrogen isotopes and how you can interpret those. I won't go into detail on that because it's kind of complicated. So basically, this is the Lago Vichuquen record for the last 1,000 years, right? And so now where it's extrapolating back, and you can see basically the range of these really modern anthropogenic impacts on the lake compared to what the lake record looks like into the past. And of course, what we're interested is in looking at different variables that we can reconstruct prehistoric changes, right, in these lake basins, and how we can tease those apart from these natural variables. So in that sense, we've been looking at with Carolina, we've been looking at other variables that can come out from these records, including the fire records. So this is basically the SPD for central Chile, right? And you can see that basically right when you have agriculture setting in about 2,500 years ago, you have this transition. You see this exponential increase in the number of dates. So one of the curious things about central Chile is that a lot of the data are not from radiocarbon but are actually from TL dates based on ceramics and other materials. So which is really hard to integrate into the R carbon package. So if you guys have any ideas of how to do that, that would actually be really useful. So this analysis down here is based only on the radiocarbon data that we have, which is actually like only about a third of the total dates that we have for the occupation of central Chile. But you can see that when you combine both data sets, you have this nice exponential increase that maximizes around about 1,000 years ago and then basically plateaus and then collapses at about 500 years ago. And one of the interesting things that Carolina's been doing is that she's been looking at, say, here's the same curve, but it's been flipped around this time. And so what you can see is that Carolina's been looking at the charcoal record from Vichuquen, which is a really nice high resolution record. And one of the interesting things about the charcoal record is that it basically increases steadily over time from 3,000 years ago to about 1,200 years ago, and then basically just drops out. And then basically the Vichuquen record has almost no fires in it whatsoever for the last 1,000 years. And then you can only see the very, very recent fires that we've had in 2015, and that's that peak right there. So that's the magnitude of the very recent fires, which are pretty catastrophic compared to the fires that we were having in the Paleo record 1,000 years ago. So we were asking, was this climate change or was it human activity that was driving this fire record in the Vichuquen record, right? And so we're kind of trying to control for both of those intervals. So and so, for example, this is a comparison to the climate records that we have that are at a resolution that's comparable to the Vichuquen record. And you can see, for example, this is the Ryan et al. ENSO record from offshore Lima, and it's basically a class record. So the number of class basically reflect El Nino events, and the lack of class basically reflect La Nina events, or lack of precipitation. And you can see that the Chaco record from Vichuquen actually drops out very, very quickly. So there's a big regime shift right here at the onset of the medieval climate anomaly, which actually coincides remarkably well with the onset of the medieval climate anomaly, and the drop in El Nino activity. But what's interesting is that it doesn't bounce back during La Nina, right? So when you have an increase in La Nina activity in the Little Ice Age, at the onset of the Little Ice Age, it basically, you don't see a bounce back in the charcoal activity. So why is this? Why is this happening? Why is there no bounce back? So it's clearly not just climate that's driving this curve. So it may have driven the onset, right, of the drop in charcoal activity and fire activity, but then clearly there's some other shift that was going on in terms of the agriculture in the Central Valley of Chile that may have driven the lack of fire. And this may actually be a change in fire practices, for example, and slash and burn practices. Right. So basically, this is that's basically the state of where we're at with this work. We're trying to synthesize it and basically write a chapter for People 3K contribution, sort of looking at the major conclusions that we're seeing in terms of the biogeochemical and fire frequency changes that you're seeing. So these are all ecosystem level processes, as I set out. Clearly, when you see the largest changes in any of its records in central Chile is at the onset of the regional Anthropocene, sometime in the 20th century, in the mid-20th century. And it really is, basically local policies that are driving these big changes in the ecosystems. And they have this interesting fire history that doesn't appear to be solely driven by climate. And we've actually looked at other records of fire apart from Vichuquen. None of them are nearly as nice in terms of resolution as Vichuquen. But they certainly show similar patterns in terms of fire dropping off at the onset of the medieval climate anomaly. And so now that we know the magnitude of what really, what large anthropogenic impacts drive on these lake sediment records, we can actually use these to derive a hypothesis regarding what we would expect to see in the past record, and sort of synthesize that information, and then use that as a hypothesis tester. So that's basically the idea behind this entire, and this is what we talked about when we talked about in that meeting in San Rafael as well, is to establish these kinds of theoretical outsets, so that we can now look at lake records and see when can we actually tease apart these anthropogenic signals, right, in terms of land use cover changes. And of course, we're developing with Carolina any sort of local proxies for human population size based on compound specific analysis. So one of the things that's promising is to look at fecal sterols in lake sediment records. So it's looking at the organic geochemistry in the lake sediment records. And because we know that several of these compounds actually can track local human population sizes. So then we compare the local human population sizes based on the geochemical analyses to the regional SPDs and see if where are the matches and mismatches in these curves.
What is your idea about the irrigation system? How was the way that the farming was irrigated? Is one question, because in summer there is no rain.
Yeah.
And another question is, how is the relationship that are you thinking about the human population growth and deforestation, if any?
So that's one of the things that's still pending of what we need to look at is the pollen data. So we actually haven't gotten the pollen data yet to actually compare with to see if we can actually see any deforestation in terms of tree cover. The problem really is that a lot of the vegetation from central Chile, sclerophyllous vegetation, is insect pollinated. So it's not a good indicator usually of what you can see in a lake record in terms of pollen concentrations if they were more wind pollinated taxa. So that's one of that would be one of the issues. And one of the things that we're really trying to develop is to use ancient DNA as a tracer for a lot of these vegetation changes that we're seeing, which would actually be a more careful indicator, we think, of local vegetation abundances that we could then use to answer questions about deforestation. And then regarding the other question about irrigation, yeah, you probably know more about irrigation Central Chile than I do, Adolfo. You're right in that it is a Mediterranean climate, so we do see extensive droughts like the current one that we're seeing right now. And apparently the most severe drought that we had, based on the tree rim record in Central Chile, was back in the 1400s. So other than that, there really isn't any precedent for the large scale drought that we're seeing right now. And so clearly there must have been some sort of shift where there was less land use clearing using fire and more heavily irrigated culture technology that favored fire suppression. But we're still lacking a number of other indicators that we can actually use to answer those questions. But it's exactly where we want to go with this, right? So this is a sort of an integrated ecosystem reconstruction project where we're looking at the number of different variables that can be forcing the watershed changes that we're seeing in these basins, aside from just climate change.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks for the question.